level of anticipation and that positive attitude toward our Christian faith as that kid did, realizing that no matter what we've done in life, no matter how bad it seems to get, we still have a chance at bat. We still have an opportunity to get out there and make a difference, and that God is with us every step of the way. The readings today, which I'm going to talk about, are wonderful, wonderful readings. They're readings that I believe underscore the covenant, the promise, the commitment that God made to us. And they also offer challenges to us. First, the commitment that God made. They talk about, in the first reading to Abraham, everyone that blesses you, God says, I will bless. And everyone that curses you, I will curse. And he says in the gospel reading that the Son of Man will rise again. And then in the second reading, Paul's letter to Timothy, he talks about the Son of Man rising, the resurrection. These readings give us the entire promise that God has given to us, that he's going to stand by us, support us, and that there will be a resurrection, and that we will be with God for eternity. These are what these readings bring to us. They also bring us a sense of God's timing. I think we human beings want to put everything in our time frame. We know the right time to start, and we know the right time to finish. Well, what these readings tell us is that God really knows the proper time to start, and he knows the true time to finish. In the first reading, Abraham is called to go, to move, to make a change, just as we're called to make changes in our life. If we don't move, if we don't have action, we're like water that stands in a lake. Sooner or later it becomes stagnant, doesn't it? And so does our faith. If our faith isn't continually challenged, and we're moved, and we're open to the call of God to make a difference, to make a change, we become stagnant in our faith. And that's what happened with Abraham. He was called to move forward. He was called to go. And what I think is the interesting part of the first reading is the age at which Abraham was called. How old was he? 75 years old. 75, can you imagine? At 75 years old, being told, it's time to change your entire life. It's time to set a whole new horizon in front of you. It's time to move. It's time to leave what you know is home and go to a new place. 75 years old. Most of us figure, boy, I can't wait to get to 65 and then I'll retire. I don't have to do anything. I can relax. I can go and watch my kids with their kids, and I can be a grandparent and laugh at them because they're having to put up with everything I put up with. God is telling us in the first reading that he has challenges for us no matter our age, no matter how young we are, no matter how old we are. My wife was telling me she watched Phil Donahue the other day, and they had a group of people all over 100 years old, a whole bunch of them that were active. One man is competing in sporting events, over 100. Another man, over 100, just started a business. Over 100. A woman, over 100, still punches a clock every day at work. These are people who said, I am open no matter what my age is. I am not going to determine when it's time to quit or when it's time to start. I'm going to let somebody else do that for me. And so what the first reading is encouraging us to do is being open to God's call, no matter our age, no matter our circumstance in life. And who knows what that call might be. How horrendous a call, how wonderful a call. There was a young girl who was dying. And the only thing that would save her was a blood transfusion. And it was determined that the only person who had the proper blood was her brother, her 10-year-old baby brother. And so the hospital, the doctors, and the family, the parents went to this younger brother and said, your sister is going to die unless she gets a blood transfusion. Would you be willing to do this for us and for your sister? Well, it's a true story, and the story goes and says that the young boy closed his eyes and said a little prayer, and about a minute later he opened them and said, "Yes, I will do that." And the day came, and the young boy is laid out on a bed in a hospital room, his sister on the bed next to him, and they have all the tubes and needles going back and forth, and the transfusion began. A little while later, that young boy called the nurse over, and he said, "Nurse, I'm feeling lightheaded. I'm starting to feel weak. I think it's time." And the nurse said, "What do you mean, time for what?" And he said, "I think I'm dying now." This young boy thought that when he was asked to give a transfusion to his sister, that it meant giving all of his blood. And that he was willing to risk his life, to give his life for the love of his sister. How far are we willing to go in our lives for the people we love, for the people around us? The first reading says we are to be open to go when God calls, to move. It's the only way our faith stays vibrant. The second reading talks about the second step, and that's trust. We have to learn to trust. Once we say we'll go, then we really have to fall on trust, don't we? Because if we don't trust God, we're going to get lost out there. But the trick on trust is this. Who do you trust? Who do you trust? When you want information on certain things, who do you turn to? I think we make mistakes sometimes in our lives. We go to our brother-in-law for advice. Nothing against brother-in-laws. Or we go to our friend or our neighbor instead of going to experts, people who really know and have the information we're looking for. Trust is very important, but who we trust is as important. There were two hunters that really loved hunting so much that they hired a plane and they asked the plane to drop them in the middle of the woods so they can hunt for a week. And they said, "Please come and pick us up a week later." So sure enough, a week later, that little plane lands, and here are these two proud hunters standing there. And they bagged 2 moose, killed 2 moose. And the pilot of the plane says, "Gentlemen," he says, I don't think my plane can carry you 2 hunters and your 2 moose. We can take 2 hunters and 1 moose." And they looked at him, the hunters looked at the pilot and said, "Well, wait a minute. Last year we did this same thing, and we had a pilot and a plane just like yours, and we got 2 moose, and he flew us and our moose out of here." So this pilot thought for a minute, and he said, "Well, if another pilot can do it, then I can do it." So they loaded up the 2 moose, and they loaded up the 2 hunters, and then the pilot gets on, starts the plane, and the plane starts going down the runway, but it's having a hard time because it's overloaded. And it keeps pushing, and finally it gets up, and then it comes down. And then finally it gets up into the air, and it barely misses some trees. And as it's going and flying, it barely misses the side of a mountain. And a short time later, it begins to falter, and it crashes into a lake. And the pilot looks around, and both hunters are okay. Everybody's okay. And he says, "Hey, guys, I'm sorry. I apologize." He says, "I know you told me that the other guy, the pilot last year, flew you out. I'm sorry I wasn't able to do it." And the hunter looked at him and said, "Oh, well, you got us 3 miles farther than he did." Who do we trust in life? Who do we listen to? The second reading tells us there is only one person to truly trust, and that's God. But how often do we turn to God when we need things? How often do we turn to God and rely on Him? How many times do we turn to God and ask questions? Should I do this? More often than not, we go to God after we've made the mistake. How often do we go to God before and say, "Am I heading in the right direction?" And then trusting His answer. We must learn to trust. The third reading talks about the third step, or the third phase, which is quitting. Many times we determine when it's time to quit. We make the choices. I'm 65 years old, so I'm quitting now. I'm retiring. Or I've reached the top, so I'm quitting. There's two reasons we quit. Either we've attained what we wanted, we've reached the top, or it got too hard and we quit. What the third reading, the gospel reading, is saying is that God knows when it's the right time. God will tell us when it's time to stop. God will tell us when it's the perfect time to quit. How does this come out in the gospel? If you remember, Peter, James, and John are on the mountain. They've seen this incredible vision of Jesus the Messiah. They saw Moses and they saw Elijah. And Peter jumps up. I mean, these two are the greatest men in Jewish history. And Peter jumps up and he says, let us erect booths right here, tents. Let us build stages right here to really pay homage to the fact that you three were here. Elijah, the greatest prophet. Moses, the greatest lawgiver. And you, Jesus the Messiah. And what does Jesus say? Jesus says no. He said, you, Peter, are thinking it's time to quit because you're using human thinking. You're using your mind. Rise above. Listen to God. This is not God's time. There will be a day of resurrection. There will be Easter. The Son of Man will rise from the dead. And then the job is complete. Does that make sense? We try to complete our tasks when we want to, when we should be open to God. Because if we let God do His thing and His fulfillment, then things will happen in God's way. And it's a more beautiful ending, a more beautiful conclusion. We have to remember, and the third reading is telling us to stay the course, to not quit, to not give up, if what we've done has been inspired by God, and we've trusted in God along the way, then let's not quit until God tells us time. Let's listen to God before we give up. It is said that a saint is just a sinner who didn't quit. Just somebody who kept at it, who stayed the course. There was a man named George Danzig. I don't know if any of you are into mathematics. But George Danzig is one of the greatest mathematicians alive today. George Danzig in the 1930s was graduating from university, and he had his final test, his finals at the university. And every student was concerned because those students knew that when they graduated, even though they had their diploma, they were going to trade it in for a place in line in a soup kitchen. Because there were no jobs. There were no jobs available. And those of you that are old enough remember the Depression. There were no jobs available. So it was announced at George Danzig's University that the student who finished the best on the math test would be offered an assistant professorship job at the university. So this was some prize to work for. So George went home and he studied. And he studied and he worked hard. He studied so hard that he forgot what time the test was. And he showed up late. And he walked into class, and the class was already taking the test. And he went to the professor's desk, and he took the test, and he went and he sat down. There were 8 questions on the test. And he started to answer them. He answered number 1, number 2, number 3. All the way through number 8, he sailed by them. He knew the answers. And then he noticed there were 2 questions up on the chalkboard. So he wrote those down on his sheet of paper. And he worked on question 1. He couldn't get the answer. Then he worked on question 2. Couldn't get the answer. And he was frustrated. The class was over. He went to the professor and said, "Professor, I didn't finish the test. May I have a little more time?" The professor said, "You can have until Friday." True story now. So George took the test home and he worked on those questions. He worked hard. He worked diligently. He didn't quit. He worked on them all night Monday, all day and night Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and finally late Thursday night, he answered question number 1. And Friday morning, he answered question number 2. And he rushed back to the university and he handed in his test and then went home. hoping and praying that he did well and would be offered this assistant professorship. Sunday morning, 7 a.m., a knocking at his door. George wakes up, deep sleep, runs downstairs, and who's there but the professor? Now this shocked George because the professor had never come to visit him. And the professor said, George, I got to ask you a question, something I'm trying to understand. He said, you were late for class the morning of the test, weren't you? And George said, yes, Professor, I was. He said, so you weren't there when I announced to the class that I was so proud to be their professor, and that I looked forward to seeing the great things they were going to accomplish in their lives. And George said, that's right, Professor, I wasn't there for that. He says, then you weren't there when I wrote those 2 problems on the chalkboard, were you? George says, no, I wasn't there for that, Professor. And the professor says, then you didn't hear me say that as you young students go through the rest of your lives, here are 2 mathematical problems that you can take with you. 2 completely unsolvable mathematical problems that you can play with and work on for the rest of your life. 2 problems that Einstein, to his dying day, was unable to solve. You didn't hear me say that, did you, George? George said no. He said, George, you made mathematical history. You answered both the questions. You got them both right. If George were standing here today, he would say that he was able to solve the questions because A, he was willing to take a chance. B, he's trusted in something bigger than himself. And C, he stayed the course, he didn't quit. That's what we're called to do by today's readings. That's what we're asked to do by God. God is going to honor his covenant, his commitment to us. We have to be there and respond to the challenges that he's given to us. In this parish, we've got an organization called the Lay Pastor Society. This is an organization that, in my opinion, has met all 3. They answered the call to go. They were willing to trust in the Lord along the way. And number 3, they stayed the course. And it's not always easy to stay the course. There are many times when they wanted to quit. There's many times when they had an entire month of phone calls where people said, I don't want to talk to you. Or where they just got a tape machine for month after month after month. No response, no call back. There were many times when they got nasty remarks about, I think what you're doing is stupid. But you know what? In the last 4 years, we've had 13 members of this parish that completed their commitment of 3 years service to this parish. Despite the hang-ups, despite everything else that may have gone wrong, these 13 people said, I'm going to make a commitment for 3 years, and they stuck to it. I'm very proud of them. Father Hal's very proud, and you parish should be very, very proud. We're living in a time where people don't honor commitments. In California, 2 out of every 3 marriages end in divorce. But here we have 13 members of this parish that said, I will make a commitment, and stuck to it. The reason they were able to do that was because every now and again they'd get one phone call that said, thank you. They would get a letter that said, I know I never responded when you left the messages on my tape machine, but for the last 2 years it's been very bad financially for me. And sometimes in a month that was the only positive message I got. God bless you and thank you for that. The Lay Pastor Society has been in this church for 4 years, and over the 4 years, this parish has grown. It's grown by over 100 families. That's what, 400 people? If there's 4 per family? That's incredible. I think it's wonderful. But we need more lay pastors to carry it on. We've got 24 now. We need more lay pastors. If you, somewhere in your heart, feel the call of God to do something, if you want to trust in the Lord in a whole new way, and if you're willing to stay the course and make the commitment, please see me, see Father, or see one of the other lay pastors after Mass. There is a resurrection day coming. There is an Easter. It's promised by God. But we're also expected to make certain sacrifices on our own. We are expected to answer the call of God. We're expected to trust in Him fully and completely. And we're expected to stay the course. God bless you all.